Hello year 7s and God bless you guys. I hope that you're doing well. But let's get straight into it again because I have another question for you. And my question is this. Why, when I kick a soccer ball, does that soccer ball not continue to move on forever? It eventually comes to a halt, hey? Again, why do most moving objects eventually stop? Have a think about it. The answer to that question is behind this piece of paper, and it is our topic for this lesson. Are you ready for it? The answer is friction. So friction is a force. It's a contact force, meaning it works when it's physically contacting something. So if we put our hands together and rubs them again, there is this friction, this force that is working against my hands. That's why I can feel heat. It is a contact force. As well as that, friction works in the opposite direction of movement. Think back to that soccer ball analogy. Why does that soccer ball eventually stop? Well, it's because of friction. If I kicked the soccer ball in this direction and the ball is moving, well, we know that friction works in the opposite direction. So which direction is friction moving in? Well, it would be this direction, hey? So if we draw that on a force diagram, the direction of movement is this way, and friction is this way. The force of friction, if you can think about when an object rubs against something, it's almost like it's gripping it, trying to get it to slow down. And that's what friction is, in a sense. The way that friction works depends on two main principles. Number one is how rough the surface is. So you might think, well, I know that sandpaper is really rough, but this bench is pretty smooth, this tile is pretty smooth. Most objects, they look pretty smooth when you are far away enough. But when you think microscopically, things aren't as smooth as they think we are. So I'll show you a couple of pictures now. This one's an interesting one. It is of a gecko's pad, its little feet. And we can see that it's got all these little grooves, all these little tips that make it, yeah, there's a few other players like electricity and static and all that involved, but all these grooves help it to create a rougher surface. Check this out. This is paper when looked under a microscope. It doesn't look as smooth as we initially thought it was, hey? So friction depends on how rough the object is. Imagine, have you ever been ice skating before? What does it feel like when you're ice skating? It's a bit hard to stand up, right? It's because it's so slippery. Ice is a very smooth surface. As opposed to standing up on carpet or on gravel, it's a lot easier to grip. So with an analogy now, let me demonstrate that. I've got two different types of surfaces here. I've got sandpaper and I have tile. When I place this remote on sandpaper and on tile, which surface do you think this remote is going to slide down more easily? Think about in terms of friction. The more rough the surface is, the greater the amount of friction. The smoother the surface is, like in an ice skating ring, the lesser the amount of friction. So, unsurprisingly, when I place the remote on the tile surface, it slides down quite easily. However, when I place the remote on the sandpaper, it doesn't slide down at all, and you need a much greater angle. So the principle is this. Friction depends on how rough the surface is. The rougher the surface, the greater the amount of friction. That is point number 2. How rough is the surface? There's another principle that affects friction though, and it is under this piece of paper. And I want you to think about it. What could it be? You've probably dealt with it numerous times today already. Or think about if you've ever moved houses before and you're pushing an object. What do you reckon? The second principle is this: how hard the surfaces are rubbing against each other. Imagine you've got a light box over here and a heavy box over here. Which one out of those two boxes is going to be harder to push? Well, obviously, Mr. Calendar, it's easy, you say. It's the light box, but I challenge it and say, why? Why is the lighter box easier to push? Think in terms of friction. Friction is a contact force. So the harder that something is rubbing against a surface, the harder that box is pressing up and rubbing against the surface, the harder it is to push, because the greater the friction. So the light box is quite easy to move because there's less weight pushing down on the surface, so less friction. As opposed to the heavy box, there's a lot more mass, a lot more friction, so therefore a lot harder to push. With all that in mind, you must be thinking, wow, friction sounds pretty bad right about now. But I want to ask you this. This is my attempt at drawing a thumbs up and a thumbs down. Is friction good or is friction bad? What do you reckon? Good or bad? I'd like to ask you this. Have you ever tried picking something up that's really, really slippery? It's got a very smooth surface. It's quite difficult, hey? So friction is useful. In that instance, it's why we even have fingerprints, these grooves on our fingers, because they provide a rougher surface to help us grab things. What about when you're driving on the road? Is it safer to drive on ice or on bitumen? Well, obviously ice is not safer. Bitumen is. Why? Because ice is so smooth. So it's therefore hard for the car to gain traction. So in that circumstance, is friction good or bad? Friction's good, hey. What about this? If we are walking, imagine trying to walk everywhere. If our school, if our playground, if our shopping centers had ice floors, how hard would that be? Friction, it's why we have rubber on our shoes, is good. Is friction always good? No, it's not, hey. Why do we have to get our cars serviced? It's because over time, parts wear down. When there is a contact force, friction, rubbing between two objects, over time, if I did that forever, the skin on my hands would begin to peel off. Things wear down over time. That's why we place oil in our engines to reduce friction. So friction can be bad in the way that it wears parts down. What about in terms of Formula 1 racing? Do we want to minimize friction or maximize friction? Friction isn't just with the road. We want to maximize friction. Hey, so we can go around those bends really fast without sliding off. What's another form of friction that we're trying to reduce in that circumstance though? What about contact with the air? We want to reduce the rubbing between the air particles and the car itself. Hey, that's called making it more streamlined or aerodynamic. We are reducing air resistance. Air resistance is just another way of talking about friction. So in that case, friction is good and bad. So to answer this question, good or bad? Well, it totally depends on the situation. Guys, I'm going to quiz you on this video, so I hope that you have found it informative. God bless you, and I'll see you next time.